Hi, we're in the Way Cool kitchen today, and it is all about comfort foods. And I am going to show you how to make one of my very favorite recipes of all time, because I love bread almost as much as Oprah loves bread. And so I'm going to show you guys how to make some artisan bread today. In your comfort food kit, you received everything that you need to make this bread except for a cup and a half of warm water. And so I grabbed that right away. I measured it out. And again, you don't have to heat it up in the microwave. You don't have to heat it up on the stove. You actually want to make sure that your water is actually not too hot, or that can affect the yeast that we're going to use here in a little bit. So I just ran the hot tap water and filled it up to a cup and a half. You also need to measure out 3 cups of flour from your kit. And then we're gonna grab our instant yeast packet, and we also have some kosher sea salt that we're gonna add to this too. This bread is great because this is one of those breads that you can actually have as a dough starter in your refrigerator, and you can pull out dough as you want to and make bread almost indefinitely until you run out of your starter. And so this kit also, to help you out with that, we included our very own bread starter bucket, so that you can make your bread in here, let it rise, and we're gonna go from there. All right, so the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna actually make this starter, which is sometimes known as a poolish, P-O-O-L-I-S-H. And so this poolish starter is gonna be kind of a sticky, wet dough that we're gonna incorporate more flour into later to actually create our loaves. But this is where all of the yeast activity happens. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take and I'm gonna add my cup and a half of warm water right into the bottom of my bucket. And then to that, I'm gonna add my yeast and my salt. Now, this is not normal of necessarily bread making to add the salt in with the yeast, because salt actually affects the yeast a little bit, but because we're gonna mix in flour right away, it really doesn't matter. So we're gonna take and we're gonna dump in our salt too. We're adding a tablespoon of salt to this because it's gonna give the bread a little bit of extra flavor, especially if you're planning on making this bread right away after it rises. And so I'm gonna add a whole tablespoon of salt into there. If you don't like a lot of salt, you can decrease the salt. If you like a really, really salty loaf of bread, you can add even a little bit more salt if you want to. And so I'm just gonna take and I'm gonna swirl that around in the pot, in our bucket here. And what it ends up looking like is kind of like what I always think it looks like, is a little bit like chocolate milk when it's all mixed up. And what's happening is that as the warm water and the yeast interact with each other, the yeast is actually activating. And when yeast activates, it kind of, for lack of a better word, gets hungry. It wants something to eat, and what it loves is carbohydrates, and it loves sugar. And so that's why to make the yeast work, we are gonna feed it with our 3 cups of flour. So I'm gonna take and I'm just gonna dump that right in on top of that water mixture in our bowl here. All right, got a little bit on the counter, that's okay. Now, I've got dry stuff on top of white stuff, and it's gonna be a big old muddy mess. And so I'm gonna grab my trusty wooden spoon here, and instead of using this part of the spoon, I'm actually gonna use the handle of the spoon. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start stirring in the center of the bucket and kind of turn it into a wet, goopy mess. And then I'm just gonna keep incorporating that flour until the dough comes together and is all wet and kind of shaggy looking. You don't necessarily need it to be a smooth ball of dough when you're doing this, but what you want it to do is kind of look like this, like wet and shaggy. And so we're gonna take, and it looks like barely anything in the bottom of this bucket. But what we're gonna do now is we're gonna take and we are gonna place the lid on this bucket, and we are gonna let this yeast do its thing for 2 hours. 2 hours is kind of the minimum to get this to start to grow, and it's gonna take those carbohydrates and do what yeast does and turn it into carbon dioxide. And so that is what allows the dough to rise. And then once the dough is risen, we're going to take it and we're gonna shape it into bread, some bread loaves, and bake those off for our artisan bread to serve with our Minnesota wild rice soup. And so I'm gonna take and I'm gonna do that and let that rise. And when we come back, I'm gonna show you how to turn this into a bread loaf in about 2 hours. Hi you guys, welcome back to the Way Cool Cooking School. We are back. Our dough has risen to twice its size. And now we're gonna take and we're gonna turn it out onto a floured surface here. I'm gonna dig it out with my fingers here, get my hands a little floury. Scoop it all out onto our floured countertop here. And it is very spongy in texture. If you can see here, it's very, very spongy and airy and very sticky. And so I've just got enough flour on the counter here so that I can take and I can roll it and turn it into a little ball. And I'm just gonna kind of knead it a little bit here, kind of rotating it. As you can see, I kind of turn it 90 degrees and then kind of press into it just a little bit to turn it into my ball. And this is where our kneading stage is going to determine what shape of loaf that you want to have. So I'm gonna make a round dinner roll, like a boule of bread, which is B-O-U-L-E, a bread boule. And so I'm gonna keep mine nice and round, but if you wanted to do more of an oblong loaf, you could totally do that as well. All right, so we're kneading, I'm turning it into a little ball here. I kind of just toss it. I would say that I probably didn't put more than a half of a cup of flour onto my countertop so that I could get that all mixed in. And then I'm just gonna take it, I'm gonna set it on a parchment lined baking sheet. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna let this dough rise again. Yeah, we're gonna let this go again. And it's gonna take about 40 minutes for us to let this dough rise. Now, typically, it's not gonna really rise so much up as it's gonna rise out. And so it's supposed to do that. So don't panic if your bread looks really, really big and kind of spreads out on your parchment pan. And so we've got our boule of bread, and I will see you in about 40 minutes, and then we're gonna bake this bread off. All right, see you then. Hey you guys, we're back, and our dough has risen. Well, actually it kind of spread out like we talked about. And so now it's time to go to the oven. We're finally at the point where we get to start baking this bread. I cannot wait. It looks so great. So a couple things that we do is I have made sure that the oven is very hot and preheated to 450 degrees. That seems really, really hot, but bread needs the heat to create that crust around it and keep the inside really, really nice and kind of soft. And so the other thing that we're gonna do is I have got my baking pan inside of the oven already hot, which is another metal baking sheet that looks kind of like this. And then underneath of it, I also have another baking sheet or a broiler pan if you have one at home that I'm gonna add some water to. And that's what we're gonna do right now. I'm gonna take and I've just measured out a cup of water, and I'm gonna open up the oven, and we're gonna create like a steam kind of casing that's gonna help create that awesome crust on top of our artisan bread today. All right, make sure that if you are doing this at home that you have your grown-up handy, because this is where things really get hot in the kitchen. All right, I'm gonna open up my oven. I'm gonna pull out my bottom tray here, and it is gonna steam, so get ready. There we go. And we definitely want to make sure that we are not using a glass casserole pan or a glass dish in the oven, because if you heat that up and add water to that, that will actually shatter that glass in there. So make sure that you have a metal broiler pan or a metal cookie sheet that has a lip all the way around it to hold the water. And so that steam is creating an awesome steam bubble inside the oven. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna open up the oven again, and this time we're gonna take and I'm gonna slide the parchment off of this and onto the hot baking sheet in the oven. Here we go. All right, again, our oven is open, our oven is hot. I'm gonna pull the tray out for safety, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just take it, I'm gonna slide this parchment paper with the dough right on it, on top. Just like this, adjust it a little bit. Grab my oven mitt again to make sure that I don't burn my fingers. Put that inside of there, and then I'm gonna take it, I'm gonna shut the oven. And now this is the hard part. We have to wait one more time for this beautiful artisan bread to get done. We're gonna take and we are gonna bake it for about 35 minutes. In about 20 minutes, I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna pull the parchment paper out from underneath the bread, and that's gonna allow that bottom part of the bread to get a nice crust on it. Now what you did not see on our bread is I've actually taken a little knife and I've scored the top of the loaf, and what that's gonna do is it's gonna allow some of that steam to release and cause the bottom not to split, because that steam's gotta go somewhere when we make the crust. And so I just well, I'll show you. I just took a little utility knife here and I just cut some slits inside of the top of the dough. You can do whatever pattern you like. Some people like to use kitchen shears and kind of cut cool patterns in the top. You can put your initials. You can do whatever you want to make that loaf your own. So next time that oven opens, we are pulling fresh bread out of it to show you our loaf of finished artisan bread. We're back, and the bread looks absolutely amazing. So here's what you're gonna do to test out your bread here and make sure it's done. I'm gonna give it a rotate. It's got a nice golden dark brown color on it. The other thing we have to check is the thud test. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of tap on the dough here, and does it feel like hollow inside? And I got a good thud. I got a good thud. So now we're gonna take this out of the oven. And this is the hardest part, I think, ever, and that is to make sure that this has a chance to cool down before we cut into it. And the reason we do that is that if we don't, then the inside will stay kind of gummy, and we don't want to gummy on the inside of our bread. And so one last time, we're gonna let this sit here for 10 minutes and let it cool down before we dive in and eat this artisan bread. And we're back. Our bread is out of the oven. It's cooled, and we are ready to cut into this delicious loaf of artisan bread that we made here today. All right, one thing you have to remember is make sure your bread is cool before you cut it, but also make sure that when you cut it, you use a knife that has some teeth on it, a serrated edge, and so that when you cut, you're not pressing into your bread to cut it, but you're actually sawing through your loaf of bread. Here we go. Moment of truth. We're sawing through. Oh my gosh. Look at that. So we've got a really, really great air structure here, and that was created by the 40 minutes of rest time where we allowed the bread to just kind of rest on that pan. I cannot wait to sink my teeth into this piece of bread. So I'm gonna go grab some butter from the fridge and have a slice of this myself with my homemade Minnesota wild rice soup. And then for dessert, I'm gonna eat another piece of cake. Yeah, that's what's gonna happen. Hope you enjoyed making all of these comfort foods with us today. And we look forward to making more kits with you at home. Bon appetit, eat up. Lovely, lovely bread. Oh my gosh, I can't wait.